Michael Boyle's StrengthCoach.com presents the Strength Coach Podcast, brought to you by Perform Better, the experts in functional training and rehabilitation. PerformBetter.com.
All right, hey everybody, welcome to episode 233 of the Strength Coach Podcast, the official podcast of Michael Boyle's StrengthCoach.com, the world's best source for strength and conditioning information, brought to you by Perform Better, the experts in functional training and rehabilitation. I'm your host, Anthony Aranda, and the show notes are located at ContinueFit.com. All right, today on the Coach's Corner with Coach Boyle, I spoke to Coach Boyle about a couple of threads. One, form differences between old school and functional training. That's kind of going over some bodybuilding stuff there. It's pretty cool. Explosive step-ups and his Wisdom Wednesday post on Heavy Sleds. For the Results Fitness University Business and Fitness segment, Alwyn Cosgrove is on to talk about the 4 commandments for fitness business success. Really important one from Alwyn. For the Functional Movement System segment, Greg Cook starts a huge series on the functional capacity screen. This is going to be a 7-part series. Today is parts 1 and 2. For the Train Heroic Data-Driven Coaching segment, Adam Doughty talks to Tim Robinson about collecting the right data and paying attention to the right stuff. Again, really important because so much data out there. What do you pay attention to? For the Hit the Gym with the Strength Coach segment, Sue Falsone, founder of Structure and Function Education and the author of the new book, Bridging the Gap from Rehab to Performance, is on. I spoke to Sue all about the book, including psychomotor control issues, muscles turning on and off, soft tissue implications to apical breathing and how we can end up with instability and tension, breathing assessments, the 4 diaphragms, what we should know about pain, and so much more. Lots of things to get to, so let's get on the phone with Coach Boyle. All right, now it's time for the StrengthCoach.com Coach's Corner with Coach Boyle. StrengthCoach.com, the world's best source for strength and conditioning information. You can try StrengthCoach.com out for 3 days. Just to buck, you have access to all the articles, videos, and programs, as well as the best forum on the net. It's the only place to have full access to Coach Boyle. He's on every day. Check it out at StrengthCoach.com. All right, Coach, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
All right. We just got back from Orlando. You did a great job with your keynote speech.
Thank you. I have to admit that I was nervous about that, and I'm glad the feedback was pretty good. I talked to Chris Poirier about it yesterday. And I said, even to some degree, I still, I get nervous that some people were just being nice to me, telling me it was good. But I think it went well.
Yeah, obviously it flowed really well. For me, a lot of stuff that I've seen, but you always come up with some stories that no matter when I see you, that I've never heard before. So
that's good. I try.
Coach, I thought Elspeth had an interesting thread. She was talking about, I have a new trainer whose background seems to be bodybuilding for sports performance. And she was talking about cueing. She wanted to get some recommendations for some different cueing. And she had mentioned a few, like elbows at 90 degrees in a bench press, right, for the bodybuilders versus elbows tucked, or feet need to be in a specific position for deadlifts and squats versus the functional training type foot position is determined by an individual's anatomy. And Charlie had another interesting he threw something in there. He talked to Dave Draper years back, and David said that they were done that way a lot of times because first, they didn't know what is known now. And then 2, they felt that if it was harder, in some way, it was better to target the area. And one example he used was the shoulders bringing out the bar to your throat in a bench press, and then it was harder on the shoulders, and that meant it was better. That's what they thought at the time, since it was harder. And Vishon actually had added a routine, and you really liked that routine. It was funny because you were like, "Look, this is kind of looks like similar that I would do with my son."
Yeah, I think, and this I had alluded to this in the thread. I think one of the things. I guess there's a bunch of layers to this. One is that I think the steroid era changed the whole thing in terms of at the Arnold point in time, probably, Stay Hungry, that kind of time, Education of a Bodybuilder, the book came out, and I think steroid use was really on the rise. And all of a sudden, there was a much bigger interest in isolation movements. and the pump and a lot of that stuff, all relating to, I mean, I attribute, Arnold. I mean, think about it. Lou Ferrigno was the Hulk on TV. Like, you had a bodybuilder who was a national TV star. You had Arnold, who was everywhere at that time. And prior to that, and prior to the drug thing, I think there was it was probably better and simpler, and it was much closer to what we're doing right now. So I just feel like there's I don't know, it's kind of a messy path. You look at it, think, did they do it because it was harder? Could they do it because that was the way they always did it? There's so many layers to why it would have been this way. And I think the good thing from Elspeth's standpoint is a lot of times these bodybuilders were pretty well educated on how to do exercises. The bad part, as you said, is that sometimes the reasoning behind what they were doing wasn't right. Like you alluded to, like bench press to the neck, or, high bar squats, you want more quad. You do more of an Olympic style squat, feet close together, so you're using your quads more. And obviously you get more, less hip, more knee, that kind of stuff. But I think in a lot of ways it's more getting the guy to understand the thought process of, it goes back, we get back to probably the original kind of Vern Gambetta, Gary Gray, train movements, not muscles. That's the biggest, I think that's the biggest shift for the bodybuilder type of guy or the bodybuilder type of woman, is not thinking about chest or back. That's why, it's funny, Don Saladino's Instagrams drive me crazy, because he does all of his exercise and he does it like in bodybuilding language, and he'll do rollouts and he'll be like lats and abs. And, because you can tell he's kind of gearing himself towards that person. But whenever anybody talks in body parts, I'm like, no, don't talk in body parts anymore, please. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think, going back to what you said about, was it the way they did it? But at the same time, you said they were educated. And I think that was the thing. A lot of these guys were always searching for new ways to do stuff and figuring out how do we get better. And it's almost like any sport where it seems like every sport obviously has got the kids gotten better. They're doing, like, we could say, like, oh, the hockey players in the 70s or the football players in the 70s, they didn't know what the hell they were doing, and they just did it the old way. But at the same time, we started to learn more and new things came up. And I think, a lot of times we give that bodybuilding a lot of crap, but there's still some good stuff in there. And for what they were doing and what they were trying to achieve, it still was a decent way to do it.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because you're right, for what they were trying to achieve. So I made a slide for some of my upcoming talks, because we talk about this all the time. What's your lens? And I put a series of pictures up there in terms of, for me, sort of the evolution of my lenses. And the first one is a picture of the great bodybuilders of the 70s. And the next one is Larry Pacifico. And the next one is an Olympic lifter. And then the next one is more of a strength coach. And the next one is more of a sports performance coach. And the next one is a track and field coach, because so much of this really is dependent on, how are you looking at this? Do I look at this as a bodybuilder would look at this? Do I look at this as a powerlifter would look at this? Do I look at this as an Olympic lifter would look at this? And it colors what we do. It's impossible for it not to. I just think sometimes people will have the advantage, let's say, if I hate the idea of, I follow somebody's philosophy, but say somebody follows our MBSC type philosophy, they've had the opportunity for me to change the lens for them 6 or 7 times. And you know what I mean? And then finally at the end, I get it in focus. Like, okay, I looked at it through all these different lenses, and now I have it in focus, and you can benefit from that. And I think that's kind of what Elspeth is trying to do for this guy, is say, hey, you know a little bit about training. Now I just want you to see it through a different lens, see it through the lens of, we want to make people feel better. We want to make people move better. Because I think for a lot of people who train, that's kind of a foreign concept, which it shouldn't be, but it is.
Yeah, true. I mean, it's still this idea, this aesthetic idea in general for general population. But even with the sports performance, people have to understand it's important, because we could argue all day about golfers and, a football player, a baseball player. I mean, do we really need a certain amount of strength for a golfer? Are we thinking, long-term wear? There's certain movements that they use that are going to be detrimental to their body, because the golf swing is a really horrible, movement for your body. And we could say, like, hey, we still don't know what the effect is over that long term. Maybe we should bring it down a notch. Maybe, do they need all of this?
Yeah, and it was one of the things that when I said this sort of lens idea, I remember when I first went to see Mark Verstegen and the guys trained down at IPI pre-Exos. And they were doing all kinds of crossover drills. And I remember looking thinking, why is he spending so much time on crossover? Then I started thinking, gee, what's his audience? And his audience at that time was tennis players and baseball players. And one of the things that you realize with a tennis player and a baseball player, the racket's always in the same hand. Baseball, the glove's always in the same hand. So if you're going to play tennis, you've got to be able to move across your body. If you're going to play baseball and field, you've got to be able to move across your body. And suddenly the ability to cross over becomes really, really, I think, a key movement skill in those two sports. But you look at the sports that I was coming from, basketball, football, those types of things, it wasn't a key movement skill at all. It was almost sort of like, we might do a little bit of work on crossover, but that's not really a big skill for us in those sports. Even hockey, it's not a big skill in terms of it's crossover skating, but it's not crossover in the way you would think, okay, I got to be able to get from right to left really rapidly, like you would in baseball, like you would in tennis. And even in hockey, you go forehand, backhand, there's a whole different kind of movement lexicon or spectrum. But I just started to realize that made me even understand more why you really have to look at people and think about that same idea. I go back, what's their lens? How are they seeing? Because we might all be looking at the same picture, but what do they look at the picture through? Do I look at it through? I look through a hockey lens, whether I want to or not. And Mark might look through a baseball, tennis lens, whether he wanted to or not. And some other guy might look through a football lens, whether he wanted to or not, just because that's the lens that he has that's the built-in one in his head. And then he has to really think about, how can I see this sort of through somebody else's eyes?
That's the important piece right there, whether he wants to or not, and you have to, it's a conscious effort to kind of make that change. Good stuff.
Yeah, it's like Alan Cosgrove uses that line about, if I could see through John Smith's eyes, I can see what John Smith buys or something like that.
Yes, that's a great one.
But, I think the same thing applies to training. If I can look at this and see it, because I always say to people like, oh, yeah, you do such hockey-specific stuff. And I look and I think, we don't really do anything that I would consider all that hockey-specific. We do training. But because I see it through a hockey lens and I talk sort of the language of hockey, suddenly to people it becomes very hockey-specific. And I've seen other people lose jobs because they have a football lens and they can't stop looking through their football lens. And it's like, okay, you got to swap that football lens for a soccer lens, or swap that football lens for a basketball lens, so that you can see this just slightly differently, and then maybe see it the way the coach sees it or the way the player sees it, or in this case, the way the trainer sees it.
Yeah, interesting. Let's move on to a different one, which I thought was interesting because, and I'm going to see what you think about this. Miguel Sousa had talked about using explosive step-ups as an alternative for Olympic lifting or as a single-leg power exercise to use in a complex phase. And he asked you if you would load them. If yes, do you recommend any specific load relative to body weight like you do for the trap bar jumps?
Yeah, and I reply to that. I do like it. I like it as an explosive exercise in a complex phase. I don't like it as an alternative. If I was I'm really liking that trap bar jump as an alternative to the Olympic lifts. And there's the other long thread that's running right now that Devin's been contributing to, kind of about that whole trap bar jump idea and power output idea. So I think in a complex phase, I would use trap bar jump as my clean complex, or even as my trap bar contrast. But I might use explosive step up with like a rear foot elevated split squat as my complex or contrast there. So I think it's I like the exercise. It was funny because I need to YouTube the video because I have a really good video of Trisha Dunn doing them, but I realized I haven't YouTubed it yet. So I had to pull up one that I didn't like as well. And then James Liang pulled up one that I didn't like as well because it was Exos's kind of single rep box blast, which again, I like the cyclical version of it more where you're alternating like the guy was in the first video, but I just didn't think the execution of that one was quite as clean. And I always think you want people to see great examples of exactly what you mean as opposed to a okay example of sort of what you mean.
Yeah.
I couldn't grab that from YouTube fast enough or get that up.
Coach, but you don't really like step-ups, right?
No, I don't like step-ups at all.
So how can you justify then, explain to me why you would...
I think it's another one of those things that I don't have a really good explanation for, except I know that they seem really different to me. And that one, I really like it as an explosive exercise, but I don't like it very much as a strength exercise. I guess I could explain. I don't like it as a strength exercise. And again, I think it goes back to your old prejudices, but it was one of these exercises that everybody tried to do too heavy and they never did very well. And it's kind of as a strength exercise, I look at something like a rear foot elevated split squat and think I can get a much better single leg workout with a rear foot elevated split squat than I can with a step up because it's a lot harder to cheat on a rear foot elevated split squat. I think that's why I became so enamored of the rear foot elevated split squat versus the step up, because step up, I always said you'd watch somebody kind of get their foot hard on the box and then try to hold an isometric almost enough to get their other foot on the box. And you think, nah, that wasn't really what I wanted you to do. So, and as I said in that whole article that, I wrote another one called, I think step up, step down, and one leg squat. And the thing I don't like about this step up with a lot of load is that you don't get a preceding eccentric contraction. And I think with explosive step ups, you kind of do, because as you're coming down to the box, you're contacting the box and you are getting some eccentric to concentric switching. Whereas when you're doing it as a step up, as a pure strength exercise, it's almost like you're just producing the concentric force. And I just found that it irritated people's knees.
Okay, and no problem with the knees on the jumps?
No, but not in the jumps. We didn't seem to have that issue.
Okay, cool. I just want to plug Wisdom Wednesdays, and just so people, when Michaela goes back to school, we might not be seeing these anymore, so we want to tell everybody to make sure they get in there. Coach, you were talking about the heavy sled, and you want to go over that, basically kind of how your thought process has changed with the horizontal leg press now, if you're thinking of that.
Yeah, I think for a long time I really liked the heavy sled idea, but I was like, what is it? Where do I put it? So it kind of ended up at the end of the workout and people were like, well, is it conditioning? And I'm like, no, it's not really conditioning. And then people would say, well, is it speed work? And I'd be like, nah, it's not really speed work. I want it to be done heavy and slow. And they'd kind of be like, well, what is it? And it's sort of, I always go back to the Life cereal commercial. Some stuff it's supposed to be good for you. And I couldn't quite figure out where it went or where it fit. And so one day we were talking about it. And we've been doing this kind of with slide board too, is thinking, look at them more as exercises, like you would a squat, and then put them in the workout that way. And so that's what we did. We put sled march in, and on our Monday workout, sled march is our heavy lower body exercise, and we're looking at it as a heavy horizontal leg press, the old Charlie Francis horizontal leg press idea, and 10 reps each leg. So basically 20 steps. And everybody kind of, well, what about, why can't we do yards? And I'm like, because a little guy has to do 12 or 13 steps and a big guy has to do 8. So if we just say do 20 steps, everybody does 20 steps. We don't worry about how far they go. So I think hopefully what it does is it sort of gets that exercise into the right place. It gets it where I think it's more likely to need to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I actually, believe it or not, I've been doing that for a while. I've actually substituted for people because I have my lens is a lot of older guys and with a lot of knee problems. And I've always checked, okay, try the sled. And when the sled doesn't bother them, I'm like, just go slow. We're not running. And I use it in place of a lunge or, my knee dominant exercise because I'm not going to have them do any kind of a squat because that would always hurt them. So I would always say, all right, let's go I would actually do push pull because, for the knees as well with that pull on the sled, I felt like was, we've talked about that before on the podcast but I've always substituted as a knee dominant exercise.
See, it's interesting that, and we had not, but as you said, because your lens is different, your lens is a lot of older guys, you probably came to that conclusion sooner.
Yeah. Good stuff. All right, Coach. Well, that's going to be it for today. So thanks for doing this, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you very much, Ant. As always, I appreciate it.
All right, guys, right now, Perform Better, they got the Spend More, Save More sale going on. 20% off if you spend $150 or more, 15% off if you spend $100 or more, and 10% off if you spend $50 or more. So the more you spend, the more you save. Easy as that. All right, well, the summits are here, and Providence is next. It's on June 29th to July 1st. Chicago, July 27th to July 29th. And Long Beach, California, August 17th to August 19th. You can check out performbetter.com for all their products and info on their educational seminars.
Hello and welcome back to the Business of Fitness section here on the Strength Coach podcast. What I have today for you to help you make a little bit more money are 4 commandments for fitness business success. Now, over the years, I've studied a lot of business owners, businesses, and successful people. And most of you listening to this know that I'm sort of like a geek when it comes to reading and digesting information. And from that study, I've always tried to filter through and come up with a list of similarities, right? Try to find the things that are the same, not focusing on the differences, the things that are the same. So come up with a list of basics that seem to hold true, particularly in fitness. And I read an article from a martial arts business coach, a guy called Stephen Oliver, who seems to do in the martial arts realm what we do at Results Fitness University. And he's really expanded on these very similar principles. So here's 4. One is an early understanding of the need to understand business to be commercially and financially successful. And I've lost count of the number of trainers who tell me at seminars that they're not good at selling, they're not good with numbers. I've seen message board posts from trainers who complain that working in the gym is just all about sales and not member results. And those same trainers feel like they're underpaid. Newsflash, 99% of business is involved in selling something every single day. If you're not comfortable with selling, then you got to become comfortable, right? Or you got to go, become a missionary or just, do charity work. Even charity work's selling, right? You got to collect money for something, right? But you've got to get comfortable with selling. You get to understand the need to be financially successful. Number 2 is an immunity to criticism. And I've covered this extensively here on the Strength Coach podcast, but it bears repeating. Barack Obama was elected as the president of the United States in what was considered a landslide victory. But 48% of the voting turnout did not vote for him. So whenever you rise up above the average, people will take shots for you. Imagine that he goes into any room where half the room didn't vote him in as president at the time, if they voted, right? That's you got to think of. But when you rise up above the average, people will take shots at you, guaranteed. It's almost a sign that you're getting to the next level, right? And you only have 2 options. You become immune to criticism and you keep climbing up, or you remain average. Number 3, you have to have the resources and knowledge to deliver excellent results every single time, right? Everything collapses if you're unable to actually get a client in shape. And I mean producing infomercial type results on a consistent basis. You should be proud of all your clients. So in my experience, most of the time, fitness professionals, they put a cap on their success simply because they haven't mastered their craft. I've seen average trainers selling DVDs and ebooks with websites and blogs and writing articles, critiquing things, and they don't have any clients. If you haven't helped hundreds of people get results in person, you should probably hold off on launching your membership site or your ebook, right? So how can you do that? How can you guarantee your ability to produce great results every single time? Number one is honesty. Be honest with yourself. Are you the best trainer you know? Head to head with anyone in the world, could your results outperform theirs, or at least you'd be in the mix? And if not, why not? What would you have to learn? What would you have to know to get to that next level? What would you have to read or watch or listen to? Who would you have to meet? Who would you have to go mentor with? Is it your program design skills? Is it your coaching? Is it your psychology? So look deep and find the gaps and then close them. Number 4 is hiring other experts and surrounding yourself with like-minded people. Now, if you're part of this, you listen to this podcast every week, you're part of this community, that means you've already embraced some of this, so congratulations. But be active, right? Join other networking groups, that maybe the Chamber of Commerce in your area, Toastmasters if you're into speaking, and continue to surround yourself with like-minded people, maybe a mentorship group, right, or something like that. Make sure you attend 2 or 3 seminars a year, and go there and take someone you've never met before to lunch, right? I've lost accounts how many times I'm at a 3-day Perform Better event, for example, and I watch trainers hanging out with people from their own clubs at lunch, and I'm sure you're friends, but it's a great opportunity to network and meet people instead of you just hanging out with the people that you see every single day anyway. I used to go to, before Perform Better existed, I used to go to the NSCA conference each year, and I would have a list of people that I wanted to meet, right? You know, lunch, breakfast, dinner, snacks, coffee, drinks, that I would try to meet these people and introduce myself and, you know, buy them a coffee, buy them lunch, arrange to have lunch the next day or something. And years later, I'm friends with a lot of guys in this field as a result of that. And I've probably hired more trainers outside of Results Fitness and more nutritionists to write my own programs, write a nutrition program or help me with something than most people ever do. And I'm not saying this to blow my own trumpet, but it's easy to do, is to reach out and just, like, the easy way to network is to become a client of someone, right? So it's been said that your income will be the average of the 5 people that you associate most with. So make sure that that circle of influence is full of successful people. That's it for this week, guys. As usual, reach out to me on social media or over in the Strength Coach Forum and follow up there. And we can get deep into some of this stuff. That's the four commandments that will help you get better in the fitness business. I'll talk to you guys soon.
Hey, this is Adam.
And this is Tim.
Welcome to the Train Heroic Data-Driven Coaching segment. Today, Tim and I want to talk a little bit about collecting the right data and paying attention to the right stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Right? In this day and age, you have apps like Train Heroic,
sure,
which help a lot. You still have your spreadsheets if you still use them. Boo. But you could collect just data point after data point, which is then going to be fed to a black hole somewhere and never seen again.
Endless data.
Right. And that implies that some of that data just isn't important. It's not worth collecting in the first place. And maybe you just shouldn't worry about it. And so, Tim, what I'm thinking about is, imagine how you program a primary movement like a barbell bench versus a secondary movement like your dumbbell bench. And say maybe you might even do this in the same day. Talk a little about that for a second.
Sure. So your primary movement, bench press in this case, that's your main measurable. That's the one you're going to collect the data off of, and your coaches or your sports-specific coaches are going to want to see improvement. Your secondary movement is pretty much prescribed to increase that primary movement. I mean, is that data really important? Are you ever going to see dumbbell bench press numbers?
Well, I'm never going to tell anybody about my dumbbell bench, but that's just because I'm sad.
Well.
But, you make a good point, Tim, which is like one of those things is primary for a reason. It's the important one. The other thing is secondary because it's not that as important, right?
Yeah.
So it comes out in exactly how you program these things too, right?
Yeah.
You will commonly see 3x3 or 3x5 on a barbell bench.
Yep.
You don't often see that on a dumbbell bench.
Yeah, I mean, I've never programmed it that way.
Right, and that's common, right? It's somebody out there is probably going, I use dumbbell bench as my primary movement, and it's totally valid. I'm not saying it's not. It's just not common practice. So it's a good example. So one of those things you might exercise actual control over. You might have a very specific progression for your barbell bench. Over 6 weeks, you have this like linear periodization with undulating aspects or whatever it is you're into.
Yeah.
And then you probably don't do the same thing for this dumbbell bench. It's probably the second. It's like, oh, we're just going to throw some sets in there. Most of the time, that's how it goes.
Right. I mean, I like to use a little creativity on my secondary movements. Right. Dumbbell bench press, for example. I'm going to give those athletes a choice towards the end of their, of that training session or that training block. They're going to be able to increase the load or decrease the reps, or vice versa. Decrease the load, increase reps, whatever it may be. And that's going to give them ownership over that movement, right? They're gonna think of it as their own. They're gonna work a little bit harder. You're getting a physiological adaptation on your bench press. You're getting some psychological work in there.
Right. So, what you're talking about, Tim, which we have a blog post out on, is supporting athlete autonomy, which, and I'm going to make sure some people are bristling at that, but it's not independence. It's not going off and taking a nap and eating crayons at Montessori school.
Yeah, don't do that.
It is giving people choices and letting them opt in and be their own person when applicable. And in this case, we're talking about a tiny choice. We're talking about this 10 versus 12, right?
Yeah.
And, something that you probably don't really care that much about to begin with, and you're just giving it to someone else.
Yeah, good coaching, good data. That's what it's all about.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us today. Go to trainheroic.com to start your 14-day free trial. And when you're talking to one of our representatives, be sure to tell them the Strength Coach podcast sent you for 10% off a year of the Elite or Pro Edition.
All right, now it's time for the Hit the Gym with the Strength Coach. And today I have on my old friend, Sue Falsone. She is the founder of Structure and Function Education and Falsone Consulting. She's an associate professor in athletic training programs at the A.T. Still University. She spent 13 years at Athletes Performance, so she was at Athletes Performance. And if you ever see Sue live and you want to get her to talk to you, just tell her you will buy her a glass of wine. She's easy like that. Sue, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
That's true.
And it's very true. It is very true.
don't just go up and be like, so I have a question for you. Say, Sue, two things. First, I know this place that has a great Pinot up the street, and then, but you have to make sure it's the right grape at the right time, because she's.
That's right. That's right. But I will follow you like a puppy dog to the wine bar, and then you'll have all of my attention.
Yeah. Well, first of all, congratulations on Bridging the Gap from Rehab to Performance, your latest book.
Thank you so much. It feels like my first and my last book, but they say not to say that, to revisit it in a few years.
Yeah. Well, I've been telling everybody, I'm doing a book as well, and you're part of it actually with Larry, and I've been telling people, don't do it. Don't do it. And I have an easy one, so where I'm just interviewing you guys, but.
Oh gosh, I do. I keep telling people, I'm like, it was the worst professional decision I've ever made. Like, why did I do that? But I'm glad now that it's done.
There you go. Yep, exactly. Well, let's talk about the book. I mean, basically, it's pretty self-explanatory in terms of the title, Bridging the Gap from Rehab to Performance, in terms of, that continuum, and kind of reminds me of a lot of, like, obviously I see everything through a golf lens, and the TPI stuff where, like, hey, here's your role. I want you to learn about the other roles. They're all important, but really get to know, your role is super important too. And kill that role. Don't stay in your lane for the most part, but know what the other things are, what the other roles are. They're all important. Talk to us about what you wanted to accomplish with this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a couple different things. Like, one, I wanted to present an organizational system for returning athlete back to sports. So for sure, it's not necessarily a continuum, because you don't, like, a continuum makes it seem like you have to check one box before you can move on to the next. And that's not necessarily the case with it. But I wanted to present more of an organizational system so that people could see all the things that need to go into returning an athlete to play. And then to also be able to sort of help people realize that, like, you have so many different components to it. And I think that in this day and age of letters after your name, right? Like, do I want to get, PRI, SFMA, DNS, LMNOP, right? Like all of these different letters. And people feel like these are competing philosophies, and they're not. When you really boil down everybody's philosophies and right, because I've taken all those classes, and I don't claim to be an expert in any of them, but I've studied a lot of those things. And when you get right down to the nuts and bolts of things, everybody is pretty much saying the same thing, and everybody is really complementary when you put it all together in a system. So it's a really kind of neat way to sort of say, okay, a lot of my Con Ed has sort of been in, let's say, maybe the psychomotor control portion of it. So now I either need to understand or take a Con Ed course or make best friends with someone who understands more of the strength and conditioning stuff and the advanced performance or the fundamental advancement stuff, right? Or if you spend all your time in picking up heavy things and putting it back down again, maybe again, you want to learn a little bit more about proprioception and balance and somatosensory control stuff, or at least make a friend who understands somatosensory control stuff, right? Like you don't have to be an expert at everything, but to understand that everything has its place and that everything is important. And no matter what tool you choose, all the tools fit in the toolbox. You just have to put them in there the right way. And so I really wanted to present that to people, is that we don't have to, nobody needs to be fighting. Everybody works together in the same thing to return an athlete to play. And it all fits within the organizational system.
Yeah, and you're so right. It can be very messy. It's not like, okay, well, the doctor let them go and now they're doing physical therapy, and now the physical therapist let them go. Now you're going off to strength and conditioning. By the time they get to strength and conditioning, they're still working in the rehab a couple times a week, and they're still going to the doctor. Right. And there's so many other areas that you have to make sure that you're working with people. And number one, you can get the book and learn a little bit about everything in here, and also make a phone call, people, right? I mean, like, call the physical therapist, get on the phone, make sure you're communicating with them. Because a lot of people use the excuse like, well, I don't have a good physical therapist. Well, use that person that's coming to you is with one already. So just use that person.
Absolutely. You got to I just actually had this conversation with someone earlier. Like, people are like, well, how do you do that? You have to pick up the phone. No one's going to be coming to your door. You have to pick up the phone. You have to go to their door. You have to seek to understand them. And it takes a huge amount of effort. But if you put in the effort, like, you'll soon be able to build and maybe you find someone and you're like, well, that guy's a jerk. We don't have the same philosophy. Cool. Like, find another physical therapist. Like, there's so many different people that you can, try to reach out to and create that awesome team for yourself. But it takes time and effort, and people aren't usually willing to put in the time and effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I was reading part of the strength and conditioning chapter, and you were talking about working with Ken, and Ken would come over and be like, Sue, can I do this? Yes. Can I do that? No. Can I do this? Yes. I mean, I feel like that's me. I'm like, when I call these physical therapists, I'm like, hey man, just tell me what I can't do and I won't do it. Yep. and that's great. That's all you need to know.
Yep. Perfect. That's exactly right.
Sue, let's just go over some things. And again, we talked about this earlier about some of the things. There's so much in this book, and we could have a podcast every week for the next 2 years in this book. Like, we could expand on so many different things, but I want to talk about some of the things that I feel like the strength and conditioning professional should know. And I think there's maybe some ambiguity sometimes, like psychomotor control. Can you explain what that is? Because we've seen a lot of this motor control, psychomotor control, and I think some people get confused about what it really is.
Yep, for sure. So, I've kind of split it up into two different things in the book. I have a chapter on psychomotor control, and then I have a chapter on somatosensory control. And they really go hand in hand, but I kind of have split them out to be a bit different. And so for me, for psychomotor control, it's really about the right muscle firing at the right time. And so it's about each muscle sort of being able to do the job that it was created to do. So, for example, and then really kind of connecting that with the brain. So a lot of times we'll have, when you're doing muscle activation techniques with someone, let's say, and you are saying, okay, I want them to fire their glute med, and you put your thumb on their glute med and you say, okay, this is the muscle I want you thinking about. And they are totally psychologically engaged with making sure they feel that muscle during the exercise or during the activity. But we know that the minute you give them a task, that they're going to have to recall that muscle automatically, right? So they're not going to be engaged psychologically. And so that's where really we kind of get into the somatosensory stuff. But from a psychomotor standpoint, this is where they're totally mentally engaged in whatever muscle you want them to be working on. And that muscle, like we know that each muscle has its job. Some jobs are supposed to be a prime mover. Some jobs are supposed to be a synergist in order to help that prime mover. And some muscles are supposed to be stabilizers. So when a stabilizer becomes a prime mover and a prime mover becomes a synergist and a synergist becomes a stabilizer, the body creates really poor movement patterns and pain often ensues. So it's really important that a prime mover is a prime mover, a synergist is a synergist, and a stabilizer is a stabilizer. And so, for example, if you're thinking about hip extension, right, we know that the glute goes from the pelvis to the femur. It's a great hip extender. The hamstring goes from the pelvis to the tibia. It's a horrible extender of the hip because it doesn't even attach to the femur necessarily. And so you want to make sure that the glute max is being the prime mover for hip extension. Now, the hamstring's a great synergist. The lumboparspinals are great synergists. But when your hamstrings and your lumboparspinals become the prime mover because your glutes kind of dropped out of the picture, that's bad, right? Now you have back pain or you get a hamstring strain. And then when you don't have a stabilizer, your hamstrings are trying to stabilize your lumbopelvic hip complex because you don't have any core stability. Well, now your hamstring gets tight and it becomes a problem. So same thing. That's kind of the best example is prime movers need to be prime movers, stabilizers need to be stabilizers, synergists need to be synergists. And if everyone is doing those jobs, then usually the body's pretty happy.
Mm-hmm. So I know whether it was, at Athletes Performance or through FMS or Coach Boyle, I remember using the bridge as an example where people would be doing a bridge or a single leg bridge, and they would really feel it that's how we would tell, in the hamstring. So they're using their hamstrings, which is supposed to be a synergist, and they're not using their glutes. So we would try to re-educate them on, maybe give them a kick in the butt and tell them to think about their butt, think about squeezing it. Because it's not that easy as just telling them, right? So you got to kind of touch it or kick it or whatever, make them feel like during that movement. And it works so many times. Like people were so impressed, like, oh my God, I don't feel in the hamstring anymore. But let me ask you, can we really retrain that in the time that we have with our clients?
That's a great question. And the answer is probably, gosh, I'm having a hard time saying yes or no. I'm like, probably no, but actually yes, because it's really dependent on repetition. And it's really dependent on the other degrees of freedom that the system has. So for example, as we kind of get a little bit more into the somatosensory stuff, it really depends on the body's ability to do it. So for example, if they don't have proper hip extension at the joint capsule level, or because they have a labral tear, or because they have a true limitation of the psoas or the iliacus, so they're really not able to obtain hip extension, then no, like the body doesn't have that degree of freedom in order to execute the movement. But if it's just a matter of nervous system stuff, then yes, like if they don't have a true structural limitation that's preventing them from doing the movement, and it's really just a matter of re-educating the nervous system, then yeah, with repetition, I think we can. So I guess the answer is really, it depends. If there's a structural limitation, probably not. If it's just a neurological limitation, then yeah, the nervous system has a great ability to adapt, which is why people, are training with you and they're like, in 2 weeks, they're like, oh man, I feel so much stronger. Well, they're probably not stronger in 2 weeks, but their nervous system is functioning a bit more efficiently. So they feel more strong.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I've gotten that a lot with some of those, minor things that I did. Like I always say, I do better with people in the first couple sessions than after like 6 months even,
Right. Right.
Sue, let's talk about, I haven't had this on the show in a while, and I want to get your take on it, and that's pain. And I wanted to, so many people, and I was telling you earlier, it took me a couple years to really kind of give people a break. Like some people would come in and be like, oh man, that hurts, and I don't like this exercise. And I would get like angry. I'm like, this doesn't hurt. Come on, get over it. But after a while, I started to realize that, yeah, pain is so individual. And, maybe they are in pain for certain things. And, again, that's not in my personal scope. But I wanted to ask you, like, what you feel we should know about pain and how we should approach it.
Yeah, that's a great question because, these people are showing up into your gyms in pain, right? And you're like, wait a minute, I didn't sign up to deal with people in pain. If I wanted to do that, I would have gone to PT school. But yeah, the way it's working is that these people are showing up. So you have to have an appreciation for what pain is. And pain is really it's really subjective and it's really personal and it's really based on your memory. So when we look at whenever you have an injury, what happens is there's all these chemical and neurological things that happen in the body. And one of the neurological things is that it stimulates, it sends a neuron to your spinal cord, and your spinal cord has to make the decision of, okay, is this something that we can manage at the spinal cord level, or does the brain need to know about it? And so when you have to involve the brain, it's like involving the CEO of a company, right? So think of a CEO of any major company. And, you think about they've got multiple facilities all over the world. Do they really need to know that, like, the toilet on the 3rd floor of the plant in Ohio is broken? Probably not. Like, the CEO of the company probably doesn't need to know about the last toilet stall. But now if that toilet explodes and there's a pipe burst and now the plant's got to shut down, all of a sudden the CEO's got to know about it, right? And so the brain is the same way. When you have a little bit of a little bit of an issue, then your spinal cord manages that pain, and you get different neurotransmitters released at the dorsal horn of your spinal cord, and it manages that pain in a really, really efficient manner. But if it's a big stimulus, all of a sudden it's like, oh, we got to go up to the brain. So now what defines a little stimulus and a big stimulus is totally different from me to you, right? So we don't know what a big stimulus or a little stimulus is. But if it's a big stimulus to me, and part of the reason it's a big stimulus is because it goes up to the brain and what's called the lateral spinal thalamic tract. And that tract makes a pit stop in our limbic system in our brain. And the limbic system is where our memories and our emotions are held. And so, for example, like if we're walking down the street and we're barefoot because we're at the beach and we're happy and everything's great, and we come across some glass and we step on glass. Well, if, Anthony, you probably pick the glass out, wash your foot off in the ocean. We're good to go. You want to keep moving. And I freak out and I'm like, oh my gosh, we need soap and water. We got to go back to the hotel or to the apartment. Like, I need a Band-Aid, and I'm on freak mode because maybe what you don't know is I cut my foot when I was a little kid and I had to spend 4 days in the hospital getting IV antibiotics. So now, right, same experience, same nociceptive stimulation, meaning the glass in our foot stimulates the nerves in our body to tell our body that we're in pain. But you don't have that memory or that past experience of having to spend 4 days in the hospital that I do. So I freak out. And this little tiny cut with glass turns into this major event for me. And for you, it's no big deal. So we have to remember that pain is framed around our past experiences. And that's why you can have 2 clients with the exact same thing and they approach it totally different.
Yeah. So it really is so interesting. I feel like too, we don't even know a portion of what really, about the science behind it.
Oh my gosh. The more you go down the pain science rabbit hole, the more interesting it is, but it's so confusing, right? There's not a pain center in the brain. So the way pain gets interpreted by the body is through multiple centers. Like when you look at functional MRIs and all the different things that light up in someone's brain when a painful stimulus is delivered to them, it's crazy. And so there's so many different parts of the brain that get involved. It's not like, we have a spot in our brain for hearing and for sight and for all of these different things. And there's not a site for pain because there are so many different things light up. It's crazy.
Yeah. Sue, let's move on to breathing. And everybody, all my listeners know that lately we've talked a lot about breathing, whether that was, with some of the Wim Hof method or Rob Wilson and the Art of Breath and some of their courses, and PJ Nestler and the XBT, what they're doing with breathing. But you spend a good amount of time we were talking earlier, it's so related to so many things that some of the people weren't talking about on the show in the past. So I wanted to talk to you about that. You say if you can control your breath, you can control your mind and your life. And you said it might sound a little hippie. Obviously, for me, it doesn't right now because so many people are talking about it. We've really come a long way from just kind of saying, hey, we're doing crocodile breathing, just kind of make sure we do some breathing. But now we're kind of really, truly understanding what it affects. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But talk to us about what you're looking for with a breathing assessment.
Yeah, that's a great question, a great topic. And you guys know that I totally love talking about breathing. And I do love that we're getting more specific into it. And one thing, when I really look at someone and their breathing pattern, I'm really kind of looking at their resting breath. And so to kind of determine, are they doing apical breathing? Do they have sort of a paradoxical breath pattern? Or are they expanding not only their stomach, like you said, like from a crocodile standpoint, but like the lungs live in the chest. So the chest has to expand. We just also want to see that diaphragm descend as well. And so just kind of watching and observing. And then when I ask them to take in a deep breath, how do they do that? Right. So they don't even know I'm watching them breathing. Like as I'm taking notes during their subjective, I'm watching what they're doing naturally. And then maybe part of my assessment is, okay, I want you to take in a deep breath. And I do that in sitting and in laying down in supine and in prone. So on their belly and their back, because I want to see their different strategies, like up against gravity and when they're laying down and a little bit more supportive. And so I can kind of see, is it an apical strategy or is it paradoxical? And so to kind of teach people that sort of 3D breath, I call it, where yes, we want the diaphragm to descend. So you should see the abdominals sort of distend. But you should also see an expansion of the ribs, right? Like the lungs don't live in the stomach, they live in the chest cavity. So we want to see the ribs expand and we want to see some of that. And again, it really is sort of dependent on their activity. Like an apical breathing strategy is completely appropriate if someone just got done sprinting. Like I wouldn't expect someone to run up and down the basketball court and then come to me and do a breathing assessment and have them be diaphragmatic breathing. It's going to completely be an apical breathing strategy, and that's okay. So I think it's just a matter of trying to match the breathing strategy with the task that either they're doing or they just did, and having the right expectation for that. And then on top of that, the breath can really, I really am using breath from an autonomic nervous system balance standpoint right now, because there's so much stuff. When you start to look at the autonomic nervous system and the sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system, it's all about either being on or off, right? And so you're either in a fight or flight mode or you're in a feed and breed mode, right? And so those are two different modes. And so most of our patients, at least the guys that I deal with, they're in a fight or flight mode all the time, right? Like there's stimulus from the game, there's stimulus from the people, there's stimulus from their family, there's stimulus from the medical department. Everyone needs something from them constantly. They've got to go to this meeting, they got to go to that meeting, they are posting on social media. There's tons of stimulus coming at them on their social media. It's on. And what happens to a light bulb if you leave it on all the time? It's eventually going to burn out. So the only way to prolong the life of the light bulb is to shut the light bulb off when you're not using it. And same thing with our bodies. Like we have to be able to go in and out of parasympathetic and sympathetic states. And so if I can get a patient into a parasympathetic state, and there's tons of research that talks about the meditative breath and the yogic breath and how that can change heart rate and change your breathing pattern and stimulate parasympathetic. If I can do that even for a few minutes, it makes a huge difference on the patient's sympathetic, on their autonomic nervous system, and can really help balance them out overall. And it's really amazing to kind of see the athletes just sort of shut off in the middle of the day. And they're like, whoa, okay. Like they're just off. And then they can turn back on right away, right? It's like a light switch, but we've got to be able to balance that autonomic nervous system. And I've really recognized the importance of that more so in the last couple of years than probably in the last couple of decades.
Yeah. And you were talking about 8 to 14 breaths a minute. Can you just expand on, because that does seem like if I'm at 8, I feel like, oh, wow, that's not much. So that's less breathing. Obviously that's good. 14 seems to be obviously pretty high. Talk to me about that number, those numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge range, right? Depending on how big your lung capacity is, how big you are as a person, your blood pressure, your activity. Are you sitting up? Are you sleeping? Did you just wake up? So it is a big range for sure. And it's really kind of dependent on the person and the activity that they're either just got done doing or what. So it is a large range, but that if you're above that, right, if someone's respiratory rate is 15 to 20, they probably have an apical breathing pattern, which again is fine if they just got done sprinting. It's not fine if they're sitting and reading. So it really kind of needs to match what their activity level is.
Very cool. So like the assessment though, because you talked about athletes in those high pressure situations, when I kind of use the analogy of using passive stretching as an assessment, and the argument will be, well, they're not going to be passive. They're going to be moving. So it's not really going to tell us much. Same thing with maybe a regular breathing assessment. Is it going to help that in like the high pressure situations? Is it going to tell us anything?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm with you. Like I do a passive range of motion assessment all the time because I want to see like if they don't have passive mobility, then they're only going to have so much active mobility, right? Like they don't necessarily relate to each other directly, but they do relate to each other indirectly, because if someone only has 100 degrees of passive shoulder flexion, then I can't expect them to have 120 degrees of active shoulder flexion. Like their max is going to be 100. So how much can they have actively? So it kind of gives me an indication of what their max could be. And then same thing with the breathing. Like even though that assessment doesn't maybe necessarily give me an indication of what they're doing during their activity, that's okay, because I don't want to necessarily change their activity. Like the breath work that I do is more about balancing that autonomic nervous system and not trying to change what they're doing during their activity. What they're doing during their activity is what they're going to do. And it's going to be based on the task and the environment that they're performing it in. It's my job to give them as many degrees of freedom in order to choose whatever strategy they want to use given the task and given the environment. So if I'm using a breathing exercise in order to expand their rib mobility, then great. If I can give them more rib mobility, then they can pick a different strategy when they're out on the basketball court. But if they don't have good rib mobility, then they only have one choice. They only have an apical breath choice. And so to me, that's functional training. Functional training is about providing the organism or providing the patient with as many degrees of freedom as possible so they can choose the most appropriate movement pattern necessary given the task and given the environment that they're performing it in. So that's really my job. And so if I can do that through breath exercises when they're not in activity, great. Then that's going to give them more choices when they are doing activity.
Okay, great. And this is a good segue into my next kind of two-part question. So, you talk about some soft tissue implications to apical breathing and how we can end up with instability and tension, and as well as the diaphragm and the relationship to tight hip flexors and thoracic immobility. So touch on this idea about the soft tissue implications to the apical breathing, and we can end up with instability and tension.
Yeah, absolutely. So really, like when we think about the diaphragm is built to do two things. It's built to give us breath, and it's built to give us stability. Well, the body is always going to choose life over stability because it can choose synergists, right? So we have synergists to the diaphragm, just like everything. Just like we have synergists to hip extension, we have synergists to breathing. So because the diaphragm has to be number one priority is life and breathing, then we can allow our synergists like our pec and our pec minor and our scalenes and our levator and our upper trapezius and all of this stuff. These are synergists to breathing. So that's great. The body can say, all right, if I've got to choose one of two things, I'm going to choose life. So synergists, I need you to pick up the pace from a breath standpoint as well. And so the body will choose life over stability all the time. And so as the body is trying to do this breathing pattern, we create this tension in the upper quarter. And so if we now start to do some soft tissue work in the upper quarter, so we're trying to stretch the scalenes, we're trying to stretch the upper trapezius, we give someone that Theracane or a massage stick and have them trying to decrease the tension in their upper body, Well, now we've just taken stability away from them, right? Because they're trying to get stability. I think I confused that up. So the diaphragm has to be breath and stability, right? So if the diaphragm has to focus on breath, we've got to get stability from somewhere else, even though those things are synergist to breaths as well, but they're also synergist to stability. So the body's going to create tightness in the hamstrings, and it's going to create tightness in the upper quarter in an effort to try to create stability, because the diaphragm is busy trying to provide us with life. So if we now try to take that stability away, because it's perceived by the body as tension. So if we try to take that tension away, and tension can be perceived as pain. So we're going to have someone foam roll their hamstrings, or foam roll their upper trapezius, or massage stick that stuff. And we take away that sort of external or compensatory stability. Now the body is left with nothing. Now what's the body going to do? It doesn't have a way to stabilize itself. So we can't take away stability without giving the body stability back. So if I'm going to spend time foam rolling someone's hamstrings because they have so much tension in their hamstrings, and they have a limited straight leg raise, and they have tons of tension in their hamstrings, and their hamstrings are tight, which is being perceived as their pain, and I foam roll their hamstrings like crazy and take away their tension, well, now they don't have any stability. I've got to teach that diaphragm, again, how to provide both stability and breath, if that makes sense. So if I'm going to take stability from the system, I've got to provide it somewhere else.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you mentioned this too, it's because we all deal with this. Because again, if we're not working on this idea about breathing and understanding and getting them to breathe better and understanding that, then we're going to give them some stretches, and then they feel good. And then 2 days later, they're back to tightness, and they don't feel like it's just this cycle of just the same thing every time.
Right. Exactly.
There's been a lot of talk about nasal breathing. I read the Oxygen Advantage, and the guys at The Art of Breath are doing this as well. What are your thoughts on nasal breathing?
Yeah, you know what? It's funny. I do that in some of my meditation classes, which is really cool. And again, I think it comes down to degrees of freedom for the system, and really giving the body, right? Like our nose, we're supposed to breathe in through our nose, right? Like we're not supposed to breathe in through our mouth. Our nose has nose hairs in it in order to filter the air and filter the bacteria and make it a bit warmer. That's why it's supposed to kind of go through another passage. So that way it can go into the lungs. And so to really teach so many people, because we sit with this awful posture, our shoulders are jutted forward, our head is jutted forward, that changes the position of the jaw. Now my mouth is open. Now we become these mouth breathers, right? And the mouth is meant for food, not for breathing. And so, but now air's going in through our mouth. It's not getting filtered. Now we've got tons of bacteria coming in, and like, that's a problem. That's a problem. So to kind of teach people this, which sounds ridiculous that you have to teach people this nasal breath because it should be sort of inherent in our bodies, but it's not, because sitting at a computer for 8 hours a day is not inherent to our bodies. And that's what we're doing. So we've got to teach people, we've got to give them a new strategy, or the original strategy that it was meant to be, which is some of these nasal breathing exercises. So, you know, I think they're great. I think it's a great way to get people out of their mouth and changing their posture a bit too.
Yeah. Well, I want you to go over, since we're talking about posture, talk about the 4 diaphragms.
Yeah. So I know I love this concept of kind of spinal neutral, for a lack of a better phrase. If everyone who's listening, right, if you just sort of sit the way you probably want to sit, which is super slouched over with your shoulders and your head jutted forward, right? Like when we get tired, that's how we sit. Our head gets jutted forward. And so when you start looking at kind of these different diaphragms, we're going to say, so obviously we have the regular diaphragm, but then if we go up to the roof of the mouth, the tongue and the roof of the mouth, you can kind of look at that as another diaphragm. And then you can kind of look at our pelvic floor. So our pelvic floor prevents all of our guts from falling out the bottom of us, right? And so our pelvic floor is really sort of an inverted diaphragm. And your diaphragm and your pelvic floor have to sort of be they have to be like a canister, right? They have to be on top of each other. And if they're more like a scissors, right, then people get into thoracolumbar extension and those diaphragms get off. And I think people are used to talking about the diaphragm and the pelvic floor kind of being in line. But to take it to the rest of the body, and again, to go up and look at the tongue and the roof of the mouth and then the arch of the foot, right? So many times people's arches are really flat, or they're externally rotated, or their foot is pointing out, or whatever they're doing. And so if we look at the bottom of the foot or the arch of the foot as a diaphragm as well, these 4 diaphragms, the arch of the foot, the pelvic floor, the actual diaphragm, and then our tongue or the roof of our mouth can really give us an indication of people's alignment. And so when these diaphragms start to get out of alignment, right, your head gets jutted forward, you are slouching, or you're in a huge thoracolumbar extension, or your feet are kind of flat and your feet are rotated outward, we've got some postural limitations there. We've got some postural changes that might need to be addressed. Those things might be structural, but they also might just be simply neuromuscular, which means we've got a chance to affect those. So yeah, that's kind of how I approach my posture assessment, is kind of looking at those 4 diaphragms and sort of saying, okay, are these things lined up or are they not? And then that kind of gives me an indication of where to kind of start to address my interventions.
Yeah. And you had mentioned the spirometer, which it's an instrument used to train both inhalation and exhalation muscles via resistance during breathing activities. Can you just, you mentioned a study, but you said the study was really only with some healthy people, like some swimmers, wasn't big enough. But can you kind of go over this? Like, is this something that really, just because sometimes it's hard to see not just see, but it's hard to tell or kind of keep people, again, can we do it in our session twice a week because we have to do other things? Is this something that maybe we should look into more of to train people in breathing?
Well, I think it's an interesting thing, right? Because even though that study had some limitations to it, it gave us some interesting information, because it's really sort of the first study that at least I've ever read that shows that breathing training can change someone's posture. And I was like, whoa, that's really interesting to me, right? To really see almost like a structural change in their thoracic curve. Was really interesting to me, because when you look at that diaphragm, I mean, that diaphragm goes all the way up to T6. So it's got the potential to really affect your thoracic spine. I think we think about it, usually going down low and with its interaction with the psoas, but it goes up, it covers half of our thoracic spine. So the fact that study was kind of gave us an indication of like, okay, if you do some breathing training, and we train the diaphragm, or have the potential to train the diaphragm, just like we do with any other muscle, which is with resistance. So if we can do that with resistance and sort of start to teach the body how to breathe with resistance, and then it has the potential to alter our posture, that's got the potential to be something pretty amazing. So I thought it was an interesting study that I wanted to include and kind of talk about.
What about breath holds? Again, going back to some of the guys that, Wim Hof and the guys like Brian McKenzie talking about some of, and Patrick McCune in the Oxygen Advantage. They're using breath holds as a way to kind of help the breathing and make us more efficient at breathing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's so interesting to me. I've read some of that stuff too. And I think it's so amazing and so interesting at how we can train the body for almost anything, right? And it's something that, again, I think it goes back to the degrees of freedom for the organism, and really teaching the body and providing the body with as many strategies as possible so it can do what it needs to do, given the task and given the environment. That's what it comes down to. I know this is the dynamic systems theory that I talk about in the book, and I know I keep going back to it, but I really think that it's totally reshaped the way I kind of approach patients and approach people. Is, functional training isn't standing on an unstable surface with my eyes closed. Like that's not functional training. Functional training is giving the organism as many options as it can so it can perform the task given the environment. So when you're in different environments, like the Wim Hof guys are, and they're doing some pretty crazy environmental stuff, and they need to have different strategies, and they're using those strategies so they can withstand some of those elements, and vice versa. They're withstanding some of those elements because they've trained themselves to withstand those elements. So it's pretty interesting to kind of see how when we give the body options, the nervous system is smart, right? Like, we think our conscious is smart. Our unconsciousness is so intelligent, and it's going to select the thing that we need in order to survive. So if you have the ability to hold your breath, or to breathe out of one nostril, or to breathe out of the other, or to breathe out of your mouth, or to breathe with your thoracic mobility, right? To have enough mobility there, and all of these things, it's going to choose the strategy it needs when it needs it. It's so intelligent.
So cool. It's so interesting. Sue, there's so much stuff, but I want to finish up something I forgot to ask before. We were talking about in the Psychomotor Control chapter, but because I think it's important for strength and conditioning and fitness professionals to really get, to talk about this, and that is muscles turning on or off. And I want you to go over, give us a kind of an overview of this section, because it's important, because I think, we do talk to a lot of people about, hey, your glutes aren't on or whatever. So give us an overview of what you talked about in the book.
Yeah, for sure. So really it comes down to, and I use the same analogies, right? And this was my Perform Better talk for last year, was sort of debunking our common analogies, because what's happened is we've started to take the things that we say to our patients or our clients, and we've turned them into our professional talk. So it's totally great, right? Like my mom factor. I've got to, kind of make things really simple for my mom, so she understands what I'm talking about when it comes to her body and what's going on, right? Just like if I take my car to the mechanic, and I tell him it's making this noise, right? Well, it's probably not an noise. He's probably got some technical term for it, but he talks to me in a really simple manner because I don't understand car mechanics. Just like we talk in a really simple manner to our clients so they can understand what we're saying. So, we'll tell them, oh, you're this muscle's off, this glute's not firing, this muscle's firing too much. So we say those things to our clients, and that's totally cool. And I do the same thing. But the problem comes into play when now we start saying that to each other. So when I say to you, oh, Aunt, your client's, glutes off, you should look at me and be like, Sue, what are you talking about? Like we're having a professional conversation here. And so what happens is we don't have that professional conversation. And so our knowledge of these things sort of begins to fade away because, you lose what you don't use. And so to kind of go back to the fact that the muscles are always on, like muscles are never on or off, they're always on. Because we kind of are always in the state of pretension. Like the reason we're in a state of pretension is so we can have reflexive movement. If we weren't in a state of pretension, if every muscle wasn't in a state of pretension all the time, then we wouldn't be able to make fast, quick, reactive movements. It would take so much time to build enough tension in that muscle in order to move that we wouldn't be able to have quick movements. So muscles are truly always on. It's just a matter of if people perceive tension or not. So if we had to pick a choice of muscles being on or off, they're always going to be on because there's always like this resting tone of muscle. So what happens though is that people get tension, right? So you start to have, like, let's say with the upper trapezius is a great example. You start to have this bad posture. And so it creates like a sense of tension. And so the alpha motor and gamma motor neurons that go to the interfusal muscle fibers and the muscle spindles, when the interfusal muscle fibers get a sense of tension put on, a signal goes to the brain that says, hey, I need the muscle to contract because I don't want to have too much tension on the muscle. So the muscle begins to contract. And so when that's happening constantly, then we tend to get an increase in perception of tension in that muscle. Mm-hmm. So basically the upper trap is getting stretched. The nervous system is telling the body to contract the upper trapezius. And so that sort of cycle continues to go over and over and over again. And so what happens then is over time, the body lays down collagen because the body's always going through and laying down new collagen and breaking down old stuff and laying down new stuff. And so what happens is that the new collagen gets laid down in this new position of tension. And so now we've got a structural issue that we've got to deal with. And so that's when we're like, oh, you're so tight here. It's just always on. It's always on. We have to try to turn on something else. Well, that's not really it. There's just that increase in perceived tension there because the body's probably laid down some new collagen. But when a muscle is off, kind of same thing. Like when we tell people or our clients, like, oh, your glutes not firing. We need to get your glutes firing more. Well, of course they're firing. If they weren't firing, we wouldn't be able to walk. So the glutes are definitely firing. It's just we have a synergistically dominant pattern going on, which means, right, the psychomotor control aspect of it, the hamstrings are having too much tension in them for the same reasons I just said, right? The lumbar paraspinals have too much tension in them for the same reasons I just said. And so the glute has relatively less tension compared to the other two. And so it gives that perception of the muscle being off, when in fact, of course, it's not off. It's just not sort of dialed into the system the way the other two things are. So it's just a matter of trying to balance that perceived tension in the system, and really having more of a psychomotor control over what's firing and sort of decreasing the synergistic dominance in the system.
Yeah, and another one, like you were saying in the book, was the upper traps and the lower traps. Like, no, the lower trap, doesn't work like that. The lower traps are not on. Yeah. So, very cool. Well, Sue, thank you so much. Bridging the gap from rehab to performance. Great job with this. And great job today. Thank you so much for coming on and expanding on some of these topics, because there's so many in the book. We could have been here for, one podcast a week for the next year talking about all this stuff.
Oh, that's so great. I appreciate that. And actually, that's what, we're definitely going to put together some continuing education surrounding the book. So if people go to SueFalsone.com and sign up for a book preview, and we're going to get some webinars and stuff as well. And I'm really looking for feedback from people. So to kind of say, what do you guys want to hear more about? What do you want to learn more about? And that's where I'll really kind of focus the Con Ed moving forward. So I would love people's feedback on that.
Very cool. So I'll tell everybody we will have links to that as well on when you go to the show. So I'll make sure we have links to Sue's site. So once again, Sue, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's always awesome to chat with you, my friend.
Welcome to the Functional Movement Systems segment. My name is Greg Cook, and I'd like to talk today about the fundamental capacity screen.
It is sort of the fitness or general purpose capacity test coming out of functional movement systems. Functional movement systems being basically the working knowledge of how screening, testing, and assessing functional movement through patterns, not body parts, can actually mesh a almost cradle to the grave perspective of your life and movement, but it can also be reduced down to a chapter in your life where you were healthy, got injured, and wanted to return. Sometimes you'll be a better version of yourself, and sometimes you can actually be permanently disabled. That's the spectrum. So if functional movement systems can give us a measuring stick for the vital signs at the different layers of movement that we must have in place, then I think we actually have contributed something. Because before that, the concept of fixing the human body by setting up the parts really doesn't give us a good base of what we all know intuitively, and that is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But the inverse of that is also important to consider, in that I've demonstrated many times in the clinic and in the gym and even on stage in front of hundreds of people that if I've got clear ankles for mobility, good dorsiflexion, good knee flexion, good hip flexion, good ability to cover my spine angles and adequate shoulders, I can demonstrate the potential that this person should be able to come off the table or floor and easily deep squat. And then they can't. And so in this situation, the parts and the potential that these parts could do actually are more than the whole is represented. And we know what the thing is. If we find a mobility problem, you got a mobility problem in your squat. But if we don't, then the only other thing it could be is you've got a motor control problem in your squat. It's not that you don't know how to squat. Your brain already has squatted thousands of times in your growth and development. There's something going on here. And one of the things is underlying pain, avoidance of certain things. And if you've had pain on board for a while, you'll avoid certain patterns and not even realize the pain is just on the other side of that artificial tightness or parking brake that you put on. That's functional movement systems. What if we took that concept into conditioning? What if we took that concept into the way that you break down physical capacities? Where would you start and what would you do with that information? So if we're going to look at the patterns of capacity right after the movement patterns of function, what would we do and how would we do it? Well, I've always tried to reduce confusion with data, not complicated. And I think both healthcare and strength conditioning and training and rehabilitation are just really, in many cases in modern society, we have all these resources with tech and communication and better devices. And yet I think sometimes we're creating complexity for profit. If I want to prove somebody's weak or lacks power or lacks mobility, I need a few simple tests and a perspective. And that's it. And usually my patients, my clients, my athletes, they don't ask me for these controversial outcome studies or anything. I'm like, hey, you got a really stiff ankle here. Let's measure it. I'm putting some skin in the game. Let's do something. Let's remeasure it. That level of integrity is way better than dropping somebody a packet full of referee journal information and outcome studies. It just is. Here's what I think you got. Let's measure it so we're both on the same page. Let me try to do this and follow my instructions to the T, and let's remeasure it. We both got skin in the game. The other thing I think it's important to realize is everybody seeking movement advice has a more specific agenda than just moving better. And one of the things I really try to do is avoid conversations about sports, activity, or task-specific movement until a general base is adequately covered to my satisfaction of making sure I've covered all the patterns. What am I saying? I'm saying, is there a physical barrier to skill acquisition? I want you to keep listening because I'm going to tell you exactly how we would do that. So does your sports specificity need more conditioning or does it need more sports instruction? That is a central question of the SCS. Part 2. Is there a physical barrier to skill acquisition? Whatever that skill you're trying to learn. Now, if you're just competing in the sport of fitness, then I would still say the exercises that you're competing in still become the sport. If your function and technique in those exercises is good, then we can work on your capacity. But if there's a fundamental functional problem, we should work on that first. But I think we can all appreciate the visual imagery of me as a young physical therapist in the clinic getting ready to discharge a young baseball player that had come to me with unnecessary right shoulder pain simply because he was throwing too much and didn't have a general conditioning base. As we were running him through some of the screen and other tests, as we were letting him graduate from therapy and go back into baseball, I was demonstrating to him how actually weak he was in the push-up. And the dad interrupted what was getting ready to be a really good teaching moment and said, "What's that got to do with baseball?" Got one of my assistants to finish doing the push-up with the kid. I walked the dad over in the corner and said, "Oh, great, I'd love to explain that to you." I walked him over in the corner and I'm like, I would not have to explain that to Mickey Mantle. A general athletic base was once assumed for baseball players. Now we think we can skip over a general athletic base and go right into baseball. It's not sustainable. And I didn't say your son has to do a lot of push-ups. I said if he can't do one, I think it's unacceptable from a shoulder, core, and posture integrity to ask him to do dynamic activities when he can't brace himself statically. I'm not saying more push-ups make him a better thrower. I'm saying more push-ups demonstrate a physical capacity that will allow him to participate in throwing instruction and technique without having that learning moment interfered with by fatigue. I've heard Greg Rose and I have this conversation a lot of times with golfers. If you're so unfit that you can only hit a small bucket of golf balls, then I think it's going to take a long time to teach you golf, because fatigue is not something we need when we're doing technique and strategic instruction. So if you do have a little bit better base, and I then make sure your technique is not inefficient, we will spend longer time doing the skill that's really driving your ambition and your goal setting in the first place. So, in just a second, I'm going to ask you to pause this recording and write something down. If I had an athlete going into a sport, and that sport was X, meaning I'm not going to tell you, they could be going into Navy SEAL training, or they could be getting ready for a triathlon, they could be getting ready for a Spartan race, or they could be getting ready for backyard soccer season, it doesn't matter. If they get through a functional movement screen with no pain and no significant movement limitations, what conditioning test would you do to demonstrate that they've got a good general base? Not a specific base, but a good general base. Meaning, I think your conditioning is actually as average or slightly better than average as your function. Pause the recording and write down the test you do. General capacity test, demonstrating you've got a general base that we could take you into specificity, and obviously we'll find out if you need a little more of this, a little more of that. General base. What are your tests? It's real easy to go to the current tests that are the flavor of the month. But when I had an opportunity as a young therapist to propose a functional movement screen with my colleagues, the one thing that we knew was universally agreed upon within the field of movement worldwide, World Health Organization, is the first 21 months of life, the neurodevelopmental progression. And it's something every grandma could lecture on. You got to crawl before you walk. And if you crawl in sloppy, I don't know if that's the best base for walking straight. So where would I go with my colleagues if I'm developing a fundamental capacity screen? Would I go right to growth and development? Hell yeah, I would, because that's the fundamental base and everything grows out of that. What is a good reason for giving up your functional base or your functional capacity to get a sport-specific goal? There's one reason: a gold medal or lots of money. Otherwise, reset back to a general default that makes you more adaptable in the next environment you go to. So I think the world can easily see the functional movement screen in its inference to the neurodevelopmental progression that we all go through and is universally agreed upon by all the health organizations. That means if your kid skips one of these movement patterns, there's something wrong. And if they don't, then everything is right enough. In our next section, I'd like to talk to you about what I saw in growth and development that spoke volumes to me with regard to conditioning.
All right, that's going to do for episode 233 of the Strength Coach Podcast. Special thanks to Chris Parry and the folks over at Perform Better. Remember, they got the Spend More, Save More sale going on. The more you spend, the more you save. The summits are here. Providence, June 29th. Chicago, July 27th, and Long Beach on August 17th. Check out PerformBetter.com for all their products and info on their educational seminars. Thanks to Coach Boyle and Sue Falsone for sharing their insights and philosophies into the world of strength conditioning and performance enhancement. Thanks to Adam Doughty and Tim Robinson and Train Heroic. Head over to TrainHeroic.com. Start your 14-day free trial. Let them know Anthony or the Strength Coach Podcast sent you, and you'll save 10% off your first year of the Train Heroic Pro or Elite editions. Alwyn Cosgrove or the Results Fitness University Business of Fitness segment. Check them out at ResultsFitnessUniversity.com. Gray Cook and Functional Movement Systems. Check them out at FunctionalMovement.com. Of course, remember you can try StrengthCoach.com out 3 days. Just $1. You'll have access to all the articles, videos, and programs, as well as the best forum on the net. It's the only place to have full access to Coach Boyle. He's on every day. You decide to become a member, you either go for the monthly option or the yearly option where you can save some money. To access that offer, go to strengthcoach.com, click the Join Now button to get started on your trial. My name is Anthony Reddy. You can go to continuefit.com to sign up for the Success Series, 5 audio interviews I did on success in the fitness business, which actually has turned into my book that's coming out in the fall. Go there, sign up, you'll get notified, and you can have access to those 5 interviews. Thanks again, and I'll speak to you next time.